We're at our summer house, and it has been raining and cold, and yesterday I couldn't even do my swimming. I try to swim 1 kilometer per day in order to keep fit. We have a wonderful lake 600 meters from our house, and we are in the middle of the woods.
In Sweden?
In Sweden, in Sjöberga, which is 50 kilometers north of Lund, which is an old university town. And we moved to Sweden half a year ago from a Danish paradise where we had a small ecological farm. Very small, but we grew most of our own food, and we had sheep, and earlier we had chickens and turkeys and geese and so on. And we moved because we started to feel that we are too old simply to do all the very hard physical work. So now we live on 5th floor in Lund, which is a beautiful place, and we have this summer house where we are very close to nature. And we are trying, both I and my husband, Robert Philipson, the man with English language imperialism, we are trying to cut down a lot of the work because we are both quite a lot over 70. I'm 74. And we are thinking of the CO2, so no flights to the US anymore, hopefully, or India, or Indonesia, Australia, whatever. So, but friends can still visit, and there's email, and there's internet, and so on. And we are, for instance, in the process of editing a 4-volume book called Language Rights, which will try to give the kind of summary of what has been done in language rights and what the status is right now. And I'm still sort of peer reviewing things, like right now an article about the Uyghurs in China, whose educational and language situation is even worse than that of the Tibetans. And I worked a little bit with them. And a Kurdish article, I've worked with the Kurds since the late 1960s. Mainly Kurds from Turkey, but also Iran, Iraq, and so on. And their situation is becoming a tiny little bit better than it has been, but still there is no Kurdish medium schools. There is extremely little teaching of Kurdish as a subject in very few schools in Turkey. The conditions are simply horrible, and you can go to prison just by mentioning PKK, which is the Kurdish freedom movement. They have been fighting up in the mountains. For instance, on Mountain Ararat, if you remember the Noah's Ark, with all the animals from the Old Testament that landed on the mountain of Ararat on top of that. So that's Kurdish area.
Tove, tell me about growing up in Finland and about your mother and how she influenced you and the languages you speak, and how did you come to be so passionate about language and language rights?
It all has to do with injustice, which I could see already as a very small child. I was born in 1940, and Finland was in war with Russia, and there was a lot of bombing of Helsinki and so on, and I was in Helsinki then. And some of my first memories were when I was around 3, a little bit over 3, when we had to sleep with in our underwear and with rubber boots, Wellingtons, next to our bed, because that was what you could get into fastest as a child when the alarm went. And my task was to rush to the kitchen and to take my baby brother's milk bottle. So first grab my clothes and get into my boots, and then run to the kitchen and take my baby brother's milk bottle.
At 3 years old?
At 3, yes. Well, 3.5 probably, because he's 3 years younger than I am. And people in the bomb shelter were, of course, afraid, especially in the middle of the night, when a lot of these bombings happened. And my mother, who had a beautiful alto and who had for several years sang in a quartet where the 3 others were professional opera singers, she would start singing things that everybody knew, and people started joining, and after a while people were just singing and they were much less afraid. And all children sort of nestled to the grown-ups, and we fell asleep and were not afraid. So it was safety despite the very difficult conditions there. And my mother was a theosophist, meaning she was not a Christian, but she was very interested in a lot of religions, and she believed in reincarnation and karma and so on. And we had masses of books at home about religions, including Helen Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine, which one of my mother's friends had translated into Finnish. So we had that manuscript, and I read it when I was very small. And she was divorced. That was what happened to very many people during the war. There were lots of pressures of different kinds. So she was alone with us, 3 children, and extremely poor. She had studied philosophy and law at the university, but she interrupted her studies fairly early on when she married for the first time. She married an artist who was an alcoholic and divorced him after 9 months, and was then alone for more than 10 years before she met my father. But she was divorced, and she was multilingual too. And my first language, my first words were in Finnish, but I heard a lot of Swedish, both from her and from some of my mother's relatives, because all my grandparents, all 4 from my mother's side and my father's side, were minimally bilingual, Finnish and Swedish. And my paternal grandfather wrote several books in both of those languages, and I can't see any sign of him not having been native-like in both those languages. But my mother was a very serious person in all sorts of ways, and very much respected by people. She had lots of friends who were Roma, so-called gypsies, and I know from my Roma friends who have heard it from their grandparents that my paternal grandfather was extremely upset by the discrimination of the Roma in Finland, And the Roma were, of course, discriminated and still are in all countries where they live. But when the century turned from 1899 to 1900, in the second largest city in Finland, Tampere, the most respected citizen of the city, who happened to be my paternal grandfather, was giving the speech at 12 o'clock on the big square, 12 o'clock at night, just when the century turned. And I have heard from my Roma friends, grandparents, that a third of that speech was about the discrimination against the Roma in Finland, which he really deplored. So there's a lot of that kind of things in the family. Likewise, in my mother's family, when there were war prisoners, 1917, 1918, when Finland became independent, and there was a real class war, the bourgeois against the working class. Then a lot of working class men were imprisoned and in camps, and that was extremely hard. Many of them died of hunger and so on. But several of them were also sent to big farms as war labor. So they had to work on these farms, and many had very miserable conditions there. And my mother's home estate was something like 40 kilometers from the nearest big town, and they had to go there with horses and get these prisoners. And my grandfather sent his eldest daughter together with the man who was responsible for all the workers on the farm. And he gave her a pistol, and he had taught all his children how to, both girls and boys, how to use weapons. And he said, just in case there is trouble, you know how to use it. And she came with all these horses and carriages to the station and received them and signed. And then she gave a little speech to them, and she said, I have this pistol in case there is any trouble, and now, as you can see, I am putting it away to a place where I can't reach it. And so on. And when there was too little food, there were all these people who worked for my grandfather. And my grandfather then said, you shouldn't actually, because we have so little milk, you shouldn't give milk to these workers. And my grandmother said then, the children are not responsible for that, for the fact that their fathers, because some of the fathers were fighting the bourgeois in this class war, the children are not responsible for what their fathers think. If you forbid me to give milk to these innocent children, I'm going to divorce you and leave. And I, of course, heard all these stories too when I was a child. So there was a lot about things where there was great injustice in my country and all over the world. So that was something that was very deep in me already when I was a very tiny child. And then my mother didn't have the money to send me to a daycare center when I was 4, so I was alone at home. My little brother was in a daycare center, and my sister, who was 2 years older, started school when she was 6, just like I did. So I was alone at home, and I had learned how to read Finnish and Swedish, and she started teaching me Latin. And she gave me a Latin lesson in the morning, and then she looked at what I had done when she came home from work in the evening. And my first metalinguistic awareness experiences, meaning starting to understand how languages work, were in connection with Latin, when I suddenly started understanding what a lot of words which are Latin-based and which are loan words in Finnish and in Swedish, what they really meant, meaning where they had come from, what the Latin words that they were based on, what they meant. And I still remember, and I still have, the first novel that I read when I was 4, a big thing which was translated from English and which was about New Zealand. And 2 sisters who lived in Britain, and this British man who then went to New Zealand, and she really wanted to marry the younger sister, but they sent the older sister to her, and then at some point the younger sister came too. But there were words about love and so on that I did not understand, and I decided when I'm a grown-up I will look up all these things, and then I will understand why this man didn't want to have this older sister, because he cooked much. She was a much better cook. And there were also pretty awful things about the Maori and how barbaric and primitive they were. And I was wondering about that, but I swallowed it because I didn't know anybody who was a Maori. Obviously, I had not seen anybody who was darker than me, except for some of the Roma. So I also decided I'll go and see if they really are like that when I was 4 years old.
Your mother played the piano?
Yes. And the piano was one of the very, very few things that she did not sell when she was so poor that we didn't have enough food always and so on. And she would play for us and sing for us, and she would tell us what Aristotle said and what Plato said and so on, and Nietzsche and Schopenhauer and so on. Food is not that important, and just drink a little bit of water and then you don't feel the hunger, and think of all these wonderful things, the music and the philosophy and so on. So,
did you stay all the time in Helsinki?
No, we were in the country with my mother's mother for, I think, 1.5 years. So that
During
was
the war?
During the war.
Okay.
But we came back to Helsinki and then later to Vasa when she moved there, fairly alone. But I learned how to walk, for instance, in the country. And I learned to speak much before I could, sort of fairly long sentences, much before I could walk. And I heard, of course, what the people around me said. And when I learned how to stand up, I've heard this story so many times. I was really happy, and I sort of shouted all the names of the people who were around me. It was summer. I'm born in July, and it must have been something like maybe May or June, something. And I shouted all their names, and then I said, "Katsokaa, neiti seisoo." Look, little Miss is standing, because little Miss was what all the staff there called me. So language before movement. So I was very interested in languages and learned to speak very early and learned to read and write very early. So when I was just before 5, I could read and write 3 languages, meaning Finnish and Swedish and Latin.
Do you recall what your earliest memory was?
I think I'm not as good as my sister, who remembers things which nobody had told her from when she was a year and 3 months. My earliest memories are around 3.
Okay.
Not before that, but then after that, a lot.
So it was interesting how you talked about your mother singing during the bombing. And I've heard that people sang before they talked. Have you heard anything of that? Or do you think it might be true?
Yes.
Or possible?
Humming at least, before they talked, much before. But I'm not terribly musical. Somehow it has jumped over me. Both my sister and my brother are. And my mother was extremely musical, lots of other people in the family, but it has jumped over me. So I stopped singing myself when my older daughter was 4, and I was singing some evening something, and she said something, do you really have to sing because you are not keeping the tune really well.
No.
Both my children are
musical critic.
Yes.
That was Ilka or Kay?
That was Ilka.
Ilka.
Yeah. Both my children, both my daughters are very musical. And one of my cousins, 2 or 3 years ago, she went to a 2-week summer course, which was called a singing course for people who think that they are not musical and cannot sing. And that's, of course, something that I should do too.
Well, my friend Barbara would say, everyone can sing. Everyone can sing.
Yeah.
But that idea of...
I love music, but I just can't sing.
That people sang before they before language was developed.
No, I haven't really heard about that.
That would be,
And I played the piano for several years, but I had a very boring teacher who just wanted me to play scales, and I didn't think I would ever get to anything of real music.
But even spoken language seems to have a rhythm and a pattern. And that, listening to the news today, it was very interesting. There was one woman speaking very seriously and whatnot, but the broadcaster was sort of melodic in what she was saying.
Yeah, Swedish is very melodic. And Swedish as spoken in Sweden by native Swedes is also because they have these 2 accents. And Swedish as spoken by the native Swedish speakers in Finland has only 1 accent, so it's not equally melodic. Finnish is. And Finnish is very easy to sing, just like Italian, partly because it has so many vowels. Whereas, for instance, Danish, I think it sounds awful when it's sung because it has lots of consonants and consonant combinations, and their R's and so on don't, to me, sound terribly nice. So it's much more difficult to sing.
How come you're so practical? You're a world scholar. You have how many books now? 40, 50, 70, 100 books to your name?
Not more than a bit over 50, which I have either written or edited.
Yes, okay. And then papers, presentations, hundreds, thousands.
Yeah, I haven't counted them. Lots of articles and book chapters, over 400 of them. So
maybe not how is it that you're so practical, but do you find being practical and grounded in the world and nature
Yes.
it contributes.
Yes, of course. Of
And
course.
how is that?
I mean, the wonderful thing, now I'll say something else first.
Yeah.
The wonderful thing, I think, is that when I started learning more scientifically about biodiversity, and especially the correlation between biodiversity and linguistic diversity, finally I could combine my two main interests, which have to do with languages and nature. And of course both of them in terms of justice and all of these things. But in Finland you had to be, during the war and when we grew up, I mean, there was nobody to do any of the practical things, so we children had to learn how to do all of that. And if one thinks of the only good thing that the war did to Finland, as opposed to both Sweden, which was never in the war, no, never, 1817, yes, but not in the world wars, and Denmark, which was so-called occupied by Germans, but the so-called war was a few hours. They gave up. And likewise Norway was occupied, and they were not in the same economic situation as Finland was, where most of the men were in the war, and we didn't get any help from any other countries except for a few volunteers who came, but no monetary help, no help with arms or food or anything. There was a lack of everything. So all the old knowledge about how to use nature, what you can eat from nature, what kind of teas you can make, how you get your medicine from nature, which otherwise might have been killed off, and which certainly disappeared in especially Sweden, but also Denmark and Norway, that was maintained and revived in Finland. And there was one extremely important professor who was very multilingual and who read all the normal languages, meaning Finnish, Swedish, English, German. He also read French. He also read Italian and Russian and several other languages. And he was very well, he was involved in how medicine was used in those countries, how nature medicine was used. And he has written several books about that, and I have several of his books. But what he did was to write 2 books, which were then published by the ministry in Finland that took care of other people. I mean, it was a combination of several ministries, and they published hundreds of thousands of copies of those 2 books, which were written for ordinary people, about how to use nature for food and for what you drink, and how to use nature for medicine. And they were given to all Finnish homes without charging them. And that really not only maintained but revived a lot of that old knowledge. So it was when we were outside and we fell and started bleeding, our knees started bleeding, we knew exactly which plant to take, plantagomajor, and to do like this with your hands and then put the leaves there. And it stopped the blood and it is antiseptic. And likewise, if we had shoes that we had inherited from somebody that were either too small or too big and our heels started bleeding, that was the same plant that we used. So we had the leaves there. And so on. And we went picking berries and mushrooms and all the clothes were sort of sewn from somebody else's old clothes, and they were turned around so that the other side could be used if it looked a little bit better. And I still have the sewing machine that is my grandmother's own. It's an old Singer from 1902, and everything I have ever sewn in my life, I have sewn on that machine. And in my I got it from my mother when I was 20, and since then it has been oiled twice, and I have changed the needle once. Mm-hmm. And it's just, but for instance, this thing that I'm sitting on here, I have sewn these covers, and the red one which you are sitting on has been sewn with that machine. And in this summer house, I have sewn curtains for 13 windows with that machine, and so on. So
shades.
Yes,
the
yes,
covers.
Yes, and lots of knitting. This doesn't. This happens not to be knit by me, but for instance, my grandson Oki has never had woolen socks which have not been knitted by me, and all sorts of pullovers, and Robert has masses. And you have used here in the summer house when it's cold, you have used socks which I've knitted for Robert, and laces, and all sorts of things. And one can do a lot of that kind of things. For instance, when I knit socks for Oki, my grandson, except for some parts of the heel, I don't need to look. I mean, I can sit and knit and read or talk or whatever. I could be sitting and knitting here now when I talk to you. Mm-hmm. And at some point in a really sort of provocative feminist phase, I used to knit when I was giving lectures. And I used to do laces also sometimes when I was giving lectures, and people became so provoked by that. And there was one American professor, wife of a male professor who was a housewife, and she came once to a conference where both Robert and I were, and I was sitting and doing those laces when I was listening to the other people who were talking, and then I gave my lecture. My old professor Einar Haugen, who was together with Uriel Weinreich, the two people who founded bilingualism, multilingualism studies. They were the first people who wrote books about that in the whole world. So he was sitting there listening to my paper, and he was pretty old then, much over 70, and my lecture was the only one where he stayed awake the whole lecture and then asked a few questions. But this professor's wife then said to Robert, "Oh, how is it possible that your wife can do all those wonderful laces, and then she's so intelligent too?" So combining working with your hands in the garden and at home and everywhere is a natural part of me from my childhood.
Did you ever, as a child, have an idea of what the best of all possible worlds would look like?
Oh, of course. Something where nobody would be hungry, where nobody would be afraid, where nobody would be discriminated against.
Do you still have that?
Sure.
Hope?
Sure.
Yes.
Sure.
And I know it seems that one of your pathways to that, no hunger, no fear,
and justice. No discrimination.
Has been along the area of language rights. And how does linguistic rights, language rights, contribute to this image of your ideal world? And has it changed?
I don't think that it has really changed, but I just know much more about how it contributes. And I'll first say something about that. If you think of Amartya Sen, who is a Nobel laureate in economics, he talks about poverty not as not having money, not having food, not having material possessions, but something where the most important thing, if you want to fight poverty, is to enable everybody to develop their capabilities. And capabilities then have to do with the possibilities you have to live the life that you want to live. And obviously education, formal education, is one of the most important, if not the most important issue if you want to develop your capabilities and if you want to get into the position where you can live the kind of life that you want to live. If you want to get a job which enables you to buy food or to grow your own food and to get the knowledge to do everything that you need to do in order to live a dignified life. And when we then think of formal education and the fact that, for instance, in Africa, fewer than 15% of the children get any formal education using their own language, or even a language that they understand as the teaching language. Then linguistic human rights, which say, for instance, everybody must have the right to have their basic teaching through the medium of their mother tongue, or mother tongues if they have more than one, like I have 2 mother tongues, or at least through the medium of a language that they fully understand. Then linguistic human rights are more or less the most important thing that one can fight for if one wants children to get an education that they understand. And that does not happen. If we think of the fact that there are now, depending of course on how you define language, and there are lots and lots of real squabbles about whether language exists, whether languages can be defined and so on. But if we think of what we know about the number of languages, according to the Ethnologue, which is the best list that we have, there are around 7,000 spoken languages. Now, maybe a third of them have been reduced to writing. And in most cases, the writing that exists in them is parts of the Bible and maybe something else. If we think of the fact that over 4,000 of those languages are indigenous languages, languages of tribal peoples, indigenous peoples, native peoples in the sense of, for instance, Native Americans, First Nations, as they call themselves in Canada, Aboriginals, as they call themselves in Australia. So over 4,000 of those 7,000 languages are indigenous languages, and incredibly few indigenous peoples have or have had any education through the medium of their own languages. More or less the only indigenous peoples in the world who can go through everything through the medium of their own language, if they are lucky, if they happen to live in a certain place and so on, are the North Sami. in Norway, some in Finland. Sami, there are 10 Sami languages and maximally 120,000 Sami speaking those 10 languages in the world, and North Sami is the biggest one of those languages. So a North Sami child who happens to live in one of the few places in Finland where you can have 9 years through the medium of North Sami, or in the 4 or 5 places in Norway where you can have everything from daycare through preschool, through the first 9 grades in North Sami. And if they happen to live in one of those 2 municipalities where you can have upper secondary school partially through North Sami, and if you then go to the only Sami medium university in Kautokeino, then you can get through all of that. But most indigenous peoples have not even 1 grade, the first grade, through the medium of their own language. And that means they start maybe the first grade or even the 2nd grade. And then they are really lucky through the medium of their own language, but they start learning the regional language, if there is such a thing, and mostly English, sometimes Portuguese, Spanish, already in the 1st grade, most of them. And then absolutely most of them have to move to being taught through the medium of English, Spanish, whatever, after 3rd grade, and very many through the medium of English. And that means when we look at the school results, for instance, if we look at Alaska and Inuits, a lot of Inuit children in grade 9, they read at grade 3 level. They read English at grade 3 level, and their knowledge in other subjects is maybe at grade 4, grade 5 level. Likewise in Africa, no studies about African children, except for the few who manage despite it, show that their knowledge and their reading comprehension and their ability to write and their knowledge in all subjects is sort of 4 or 5 or 6 years behind what they should have at the age that they are. And that means that they do not get, they can't develop those capabilities that they have.
Yes.
And that is because the wrong language of education. And therefore, linguistic human rights are one of the most important, if not the most important issue, if we want to really fight poverty. But the problem is that the elites of this world do not want to fight poverty.
So now in your dissertation here, I've had like about 25 questions that you've elicited, but I want to go back to the first one I thought I have to, because you said that formal education is critical in terms of social justice and fighting.
Yes.
But I think too many people have a sense, formal education, that's the normal grade school, PK-12 in U.S. terms, and higher education. But what does formal education mean to you? Because it's such a... Because I would think that you could take in, say, for the Sami, somebody through all the grades in their language, but they might not have a formal education in the truest sense.
No, I mean,
what's the content of being taught in that language?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the formal education means going to school. That's it. And
no matter what the curriculum is?
yes, no matter what the curriculum is.
Okay.
And then, of course, if you have things that you are not interested in, things that are not important at all, where you have you just learn to reproduce knowledge that your teacher gives you, and that has nothing to do with your life or your situation, your context, and so on. It's not much use for you. Obviously, the content of the education is important, but if you don't even understand the content, then you drop out.
Yes.
Or you are pushed out, as we say. I don't think that kids drop out of school. That would mean they do it voluntarily. They are pushed out because of the wrong type of teaching, where not only the language is wrong, but the content is wrong, obviously. And if you think of the Sami education, first when they started having Sami medium education, they just more or less translated the Norwegian curriculum, and comparing with curricula in many other countries, Norwegian curriculum is incredibly good and democratic and so on. But then they started saying, but there's nothing Sami in this school. And that has changed an incredible lot now. So they go out and do Sami things. They learn about reindeer herding. They learn about traditional crafts. They learn about Sami philosophy and Sami religions and so on. But they also learn about how do modern Sami live. So they learn both what they call Western knowledge. And a lot of them are incredibly good with IT and so on, all of these things. But they also learn the history and the knowledges of their ancestors and how these things have changed, and how, for instance, modern Sami, how they make their costumes now. They are not sewn by hand anymore. They are sewn with sewing machines, and the reindeer herding is not anymore you following your herd all year round and walking and skiing after or before your reindeer. You use snow scooters and you use helicopters and so on. So they learn all the tradition, or as much of it as possible, and they learn the modern ways, and they learn the outsider Western knowledge. And that's how it should be. Then it is real education.
Formal education.
It is real education inside the formal education, because it happens in schools, and they get marks and so on. But if you think of formal education and informal education, of course, a lot of people who never go to school, they can speak 9 languages. We have met people in India who speak 9 languages, have never had one single day in a formal school. But they have informal education, meaning they are, it takes a village to educate a child, meaning they have learned an incredible lot from their parents, from their siblings, from their relatives, from the whole village. And that knowledge is much more important for them to be able to, for instance, continue growing their own food than the teaching that you get in school. I have to tell you one story here too.
Okay, and now I'm going to ask you a question after this.
Now, after that, yes.
Yep.
Yes, and I'll also go back to my childhood and language rights and how multilingualism makes it easier for you to manage in school. But this is just a story about and then a Sami story. One of my very, very good friends, Ulla Aikio Puoskari, she is one of the middle children in her family, and her parents spoke Sami to each other, and they spoke a little bit of Sami to the older children and not any Sami to the younger children, because they were told that they are helping their children if they speak Finnish to the children, because then the children understand Finnish and speak it when they go to school, which Ulla did, and so on. So she started relearning Sami when she was around 20 or so, and she understood but couldn't speak, couldn't read, couldn't write. And then there was this conference which she had organized where I was talking, and I was, for instance, talking about the relationship between biodiversity and linguistic diversity, and the fact that they are related, and that if we continue killing indigenous and local languages the way we do now, very probably by the end of this century, at least half, maybe even 90 or 95% of today's spoken languages no longer exist, and at least they are no longer learned by children. So if we continue killing those languages the way we do today, then we are not only killing the languages, but we are killing the knowledge that is encoded in those languages. And that knowledge, as has been accepted by the International Association for Science, that knowledge is much more detailed, much more sophisticated, with much better categories than what Western knowledge, including Wilson, the book that you showed to me, the book that is called
Life on Earth,
including the knowledge that that book has. So the indigenous knowledge is much more detailed about the areas where those indigenous peoples have lived for hundreds of years. So I talked about this too. And then there were two very old Sami men who had been in residential school in Finland, where they didn't understand much of the teaching. The first 2 years they understood nothing, and then after 3 or 4 years, when they had learned a tiny bit of spoken Finnish, then they were just pushed out. They continued with reindeer herding. And at the beginning, when I was talking about other things, not this biodiversity, I was talking about the linguistic genocide that happens in these residential schools and in today's education of most indigenous peoples. They were sort of sitting like this and saying, yes, they didn't really learn anything in school and they don't really know much. And then when I started talking about the traditional knowledge that is encoded in indigenous languages, and started saying something about the Sami, and for instance their knowledge about the reindeer, and their knowledge about nature where reindeer live, and so on. Their heads sort of started coming up and they started smiling a little bit, and then Ulla, my friend, who reads and writes Sami perfectly, absolutely perfectly. She is the Education and Information Secretary of the Sami Parliament in Finland, and her PhD, which will be ready very soon, is a fantastic book about Sami linguistic human rights in education in Finland, Sweden, Norway. It's going to be a classic. And she's going to translate it into Sami herself. It's a very complex book. I'm one of her supervisors. So Ulla said, yes, I mean, my Sami is a sort of conference Sami. I can do everything that has to do with conferences and research and so on in Sami. But even if I have a few reindeer, I don't know that terminology. And then these two old men, they said, yes, when we slaughter reindeer, we know the name of every single thing that we see there. Ulla said, I wouldn't know one single thing. Yes, heart. Yes, I would know what the heart, reindeer heart is called in Sami. But everything else, I mean, my Sami is conference Sami. And your Sami is the real Sami. And your knowledge is what all us Sami should have. And that is what school has killed. And they were so happy. They were so happy. And they talked and talked and talked and talked and talked. And at the same conference, the president of the Sami parliament in Finland, Pekka Aikio, who was a very good friend of mine. I've known him since he was in his 20s. And he also relearned Sami when he was grown up. He then told this little story. A year before that, and this was at the beginning of the 90s, a year before that, two Finnish fish biologists had published an article which was in Nature and in Science, meaning two of the most prestigious natural sciences journals. And the article was about where salmon, the fish salmon, spawns. And they had shown that in contradiction with everything that was known until then about salmon spawning only in these big rivers. They come back to the big rivers where they were born, and they can only spawn in these big rivers, and they jump up and so on. They showed that salmon can spawn also in very, very small rivulets. And Pekka said, yes, now Western science knows this, but several of those small rivulets which they had studied have Sami names. And in the Sami, part of the Sami name is salmon spawning grounds. And Peter Mulhuisler, who is a British-Australian researcher, very, very prominent researcher of multilingualism and biodiversity, he has shown that before the knowledge that people need if they come to a new environment is thoroughly encoded in their language, the time needed for that is at least 300 years. And even if there have been people, like in New Zealand or Australia, when the Westerners come, who have that knowledge, it does not translate into the new language. So if they have to find out, even if they find out something about that nature from those who have lived there for a long time, it takes minimally 300 years before it is encoded in their languages, for instance, English. So the Sami must have known this big scientific discovery, at least 300 years, probably much longer. And that's one of those examples of how traditional knowledge is encoded in those small languages. And if we kill them, the languages, which happens through formal education and through mass media mainly, then that knowledge is going to disappear. And that means that in the end, when we have all these environmental catastrophes, and we would need to have that knowledge is no longer there. And even if Western scientists might be able to rediscover it, it may be much too late. Or, for instance, if we think of these rivulets, we may have dried out those rivulets and so on. So the relationship between biodiversity and linguistic diversity is, for me, one of the most important issues, one of the most important causes for why languages have to be maintained and revived and rediscovered. So it's not only about fighting poverty and through that getting some justice to those people who are now discriminated against, but it's also about a possible future for humans on this planet. And of course the planet might recover if we ruin both the owl, but you should have seen that. If
I did.
yeah. So if we ruin the planet completely, and if we kill off 90% of the biodiversity, the planet, and including us humans, the planet might be able to recover and start again, as it has done several times. But it would be a pretty stupid thing to do. So, as one of the people says, we humans are not the only species that has killed itself off, but we are the only ones who could have prevented it, and we are not preventing it. So that's why linguistic human rights are so important.
So, in a way, you've kind of answered one of the now I have 50 questions. So, but my first one about formal education. And you then said that you were so happy when language diversity and biodiversity met. And you talked about how much richness and knowledge is embedded, encoded in original or indigenous language.
Indigenous languages and some local languages.
So, in a way, you've kind of answered my question, but I'm always wondering, I understand the formal constructed education process as being one that serves the purpose of the society. For instance, in the United States, the lower grade elementary education still follows, to some extent, preparing children for work. And I always talk about the Bell system. And my friend Christina said, "Oh, we're on the Bell system." I said, "I work for the Bell system, the phone company, Alexander Graham Bell." But then to discover that there was a similarity, because in the production of telephones and things like that for the Bell system, the production line was based on 50 minutes. And the bell would ring, and people would then do something different, because if they worked too long on the same thing, things would go wrong. And the school then said, well, children are going to be on a factory line, so let's do our classes in 50-minute segments and ring the bell. Then we go from history to language to whatever. And I see the richness of education is never separating that biodiversity from linguistic diversity, where it has been pulled apart, segmented, and then taught in its little segments, but that it should be integrated.
There are schools which do that integration, and not only in elementary school, but also higher up. And for instance, many of the upper secondary schools in my country no longer have classes, meaning you belong to a certain class. You study subjects at the level where you are. So you may study something, let's say mathematics or natural sciences, together with kids who are 2 or 3 years older than you, or 2 or 3 years younger than you. And those 50-minute sequences have disappeared in many of them. So you may have one morning of one subject and another.
And is it integrated? For instance,
yes,
cooking, right? Cooking is like,
yes,
well, that's
yes,
domestic, and usually it's changing, but it's usually of the roles, it's the woman's role for cooking. But
no, I mean, well,
no, I understand things.
We have obviously both boys and girls learn to cook and to sew, and for instance,
no, but here's the point that I'm making: that in cooking,
chemistry comes in, physics comes in,
yes,
and so on.
Yes.
Lots of cooperation between the teachers, so that they, for instance, if you have chemistry separately and you have integrated it with cooking, then you might even have classes where both the chemistry teacher and the cooking teacher are in the same class, but at least so that the chemistry teacher takes up the things that are going to be in cooking that day or next day or that week, whatever. And there's a lot of things where kids go out and do observations, and they can have both zoology and biology teacher with them. They can have one-week camps where a lot of these things are integrated and so on. So I think that, and if you think of what Steiner schools do, what Montessori schools do, and so on, it's much more integrated. But if you also then think of what would people do, for instance, in the United States, if there were no formal schools. Think of those parents who homeschool their children. It's a full-time work, more or less. And then two parents start saying, okay, let's sort of take the joint responsibility, and then there are 3 parents, and suddenly you have a class, and then it is school. So it would be in families where both parents work outside the home, it would be pretty impossible to organize the kind of informal education that one may still have in a village society where people work so close to the village that kids can be with them when they work, and where children's labor is needed, and where children learn from their parents and from all the other villagers and participate, and where they are allowed to do things that, for instance, in American schools would lead to chucking out the teacher because you can't give a knife to a little child, or you can't allow them to be very close to a fire which you have, or you have to have grown-ups, like for instance the headmaster of the Montessori school in Lund, where you wanted to film some of the kids when they were bicycling to and from school, and it was impossible to get in the short time their parents' permission. And when he said something about some parents are very, very anxious if there are not so and so many teachers when the children go to the swimming pool. And then when I was a child, we obviously went swimming as soon as a couple of us could swim. And we smaller ones, we were there and we were in the water and there were no adults there. And we had a time when we had to be at home, but we didn't have any watches, of course.
Yes.
So it was when the sun was approximately there or when we were hungry. But unsupervised things that would be impossible in your country.
Yes, and even here today, as we saw. Are you getting cold?
No.
You're okay, good.
No.
Okay.
No.
I mean, it's going to be dramatic in terms of this film because it's been sun and it's been raining. Because in people watching, should we do this? It will be watching the weather as much as everything else happening. The sewing needles, dragonflies flying by.
Yeah.
So.
Couldn't we just help her so that I could get my knitting?
Sure. That's very easy. What has changed in your thinking about language diversity and biodiversity since you started writing? And how has maybe individuals or friends or just encounters changed or adapted or influenced where you are now from where you were?
There are many friends who have obviously taught me a lot. And partly it's, of course, friends who are fellow researchers, fellow academics, like my husband, Robert. I don't think that I would have known as much about English language imperialism without him. And people like you, Connie, you have been very important, and you have also forced me to formulate some things clearer, and not take so much for granted as I do. My both daughters have influenced how I write and how I speak, partly being critical in general, as kids always are, but partly also saying you can't expect that everybody thinks about the world like you do. The people don't care. People don't think about justice, so they just get on with their lives. They don't think that it's important if they have a plastic bag, then if they buy a plastic bag when they buy their food in the shops, and they are not as left-oriented politically as you do. Remember that. So you have that kind of people in your audience, which again reminds me of a story which was in South Africa. We gave a lecture at a university the same day when we had arrived, and I said something then about the languages there, including Hausa, and my click is not as good as it should be, but it's a click at least. And then there were some old Afrikaner professors who were talking about Xhosa. They pronounced the language as Xhosa, and they were born in South Africa, and they still said Xhosa. They refused to say a click. And I said, I think that it's very interesting that this is my first day in South Africa, and I try to say Xhosa. And you have lived here all your life. You have had some opportunities to learn how to pronounce the name of this language properly. How come that you haven't used those opportunities? They were so angry that when they stood up, they were jumping up and down. So that's of course an example of what my daughters said. Everybody won't agree with you. and I don't always provoke people like that, but if there are people who I either know or think may be beyond saving, sort of, then I don't hesitate. Then okay. I learned a lot from Chris Mallard, who was one of the first. He was the first black professor in the Netherlands. He's British, and one of the things he said was don't make unnecessary enemies. Meaning, when one talks, one should try at least to see if there are people who might be influenced by knowledge, so that they might start thinking. And again, a story at a party last week. I met one of my very old students who just had a course with me. So I wasn't supervising her, but she had a course. And she said, I started that course with saying that there is no objective science. All of it is subjective, and the difference is whether you know in what way you are subjective and admit it or not, and much more of that kind. And she said now, 15 years later, it was an absolute shock. And she couldn't understand, because she obviously thought that researchers are objective and there are objective truths and so on. I think there are a few, actually, myself. But she was really, really shocked, and it took her quite some time to see it when the course continued, but it made her think. And I think that's a good example of how I might have made an unnecessary enemy. And fortunately, she was clever enough not to become that. But I could have formulated it in a way which would have made her think, but which would not have been equally shocking. So I learned a lot from lots of my students. I have learned a lot from Alma Florada and from Jim Cummins and from Ajit Mohanty, and I learned an incredible lot about my own racism and hypocrisy from especially my Indian colleagues, good friends, and from African researchers and so on. They have influenced me very, very much. But I have also learned a lot from deaf people with whom I have worked quite a lot. With the World Federation of the Deaf, and I have given lots of lectures to deaf audiences and young deaf forerunners who know much more than I do about lots of things, but then they want to know something about some of the things I know about linguistic human rights and so on. I learned a lot about oppression and torture and so on from Kurdish friends. And I have worked with the Kurds since the 60s. That's for instance why I did not, when you mentioned a saint who had been tortured and killed off, I said I didn't want to know anything about it. I hear enough from friends about torture that they have been subjected to, and which happens today. And I mean, people who, and I have learned masses from my Sami friends and other indigenous peoples.
Yeah. Now, you were talking about how deaf people have influenced you. Now that you're having your hearing deteriorate, is there something new that you're taking from that?
Oh yes, masses.
And what? What stands out? The rights aspects stand out. Some of the first
people who started demanding linguistic human rights. They were also some of the first people who talked about linguistic genocide and who wrote about it. So I have got the courage from them to tell people, for instance, when there are lectures, if I can't hear properly, I stop the whole process and I tell the lecturer that there must be other people who are hard of hearing in this audience, but they don't dare to say anything about it. And I tell them a little bit about how they should speak when, if they want us who don't hear really well, how they should speak if they want us to understand. They shouldn't have their hands in front of their mouth, and they should look at the audience. They shouldn't, for instance, when they present their PowerPoints, lots of people look at their PowerPoint behind them so that one can't see their mouth. Instead of looking at the computer which is in front of them, and then they would be turning towards their audience. And some other simple things, not speaking loud enough, and always using the microphone, and not taking questions where the people asking the questions don't use the microphone, or if they are too lazy to ask somebody to take the mic there, they should repeat the question so that we can hear it, and lots of that kind of other thing. So I really interrupt and I demand it. And then I say, if you are speaking so that I can't understand and you can help it, I'll put my hand up, and then you know. So speak slowly. So
you're making a connection for me about hearing and listening, and for instance, the radio broadcast this morning, I could hear it, but I couldn't listen to it because I didn't understand the language. And it seems like there's a total connection, at least I'm making it, whether you can hear and understand a language, or what happens. I know not only in our experience, but with my mother, who was hard of hearing, and others, is that if you don't hear, you can't understand. And the person speaking gets tired of saying it over again. And so there's a disconnect and a distancing of people. So I'm making a connection of hearing and listening being related. Being deaf to another language and not hearing it, not taking the time to either hear it or to be able to speak it so it could be heard. So that's just sort of an insight that I've had. Do you see any connections between? Yeah,
absolutely. But I'm talking here about the real basics, where hearing something is a prerequisite for understanding. And if you have some time when you cannot hear, and the people that you're supposed to hear, to listen to, don't make any effort to make you hear, then you don't listen anymore. So give up listening. And
pushed out.
Absolutely. Yes. And that's, for instance, what I do in the car when you and Robert are sitting in front and I can't hear more than sometimes 80%, sometimes 50%, sometimes 30%. I stop listening because it's too frustrating to do it. And obviously that is something that makes one more isolated if it is situations where one can't possibly demand that the other ones would change all their behavior, or where it would be too demanding physically. For instance, for you to turn towards me all the time, because then you would have neck pains the rest of the day and so on. But there is a difference between hearing and listening and understanding, and all those are things, of course, those differences that one makes.
No.
When one has had a lot to do with the deaf. One thing that Robert has said many times is he has been sometimes with me in contexts where most people are deaf. And something that I obviously also noticed at my first conferences, world conferences for the deaf, how silent it is. You have a conference with 2,000 people, and the only thing you hear is when people laugh aloud. Or then if they are eating a wonderful dinner, you can hear the cling with the glass, or you can hear the utensils, but you don't need to sort of be in a situation where there's too much noise.
Yes.
And still, of course, there are deaf operas, and there are deaf choirs. I have heard several deaf choirs. They sang, and so on. So there are so many other aspects that one suddenly notices about one's environment.
Yes. So, again, some connections that I'm making. My hero, Bucky Fuller, said something once about humans being artifact makers and users, making tools. And he said one of the most important tools made was language. And I mentioned this to a woman, I think I've told you the story, who was a nun, a very important nun, my friend Sheila Walsh's sister. And I told her this, and she said, oh yes, think of Genesis. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. Now, I had heard that was, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. But when she said that, it made me think that the Word was a creative action, that the Word gave us as humans the ability to understand and know the world around us, because we would have a word for it and then understanding. And I combined that with Paulo Freire, who said, to say a true word is to transform the world. And so I don't know if it's in my reading of mythology or such, but somebody could use a word in such a powerful way. You could split rocks. And you mentioned it with your friend who heard you say that no science is objective. So you used more than one word, but you used words to kind of give her an emotional and psychological joke. How does that have any resonance with your use of language and language diversity and who you are?
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, naming your world is becoming human in all sorts of ways, because you don't know who you are, you don't know anything before you name it. And I'm sure that's true for all humans. But if you think of words which we use every day, and we don't think of what they mean, or what kind of emotions they evoke, or what kind of connotations, meaning feelings, and how you see the world. We use them without thinking often, because we have learned them, we never question them, we don't think of them, we just use them. And if you then start using the opposite, or whatever you want to do with them, people suddenly see the world in a different way. And some words are so emotional that people can't think of what they mean or how they could be defined. And for instance, when I started using the concept of linguistic genocide, I have had hundreds of times people saying, you can't use the word, it's so horrible, you are harming the... Last time I heard this was from a professor, so right, we had a 1-hour debate at a big conference, and she said, you are harming the people that you want to help by using the word genocide. Now the first thing is I don't use the word help, because in order to help somebody you first have to construct them as helpless. They have no agency, they can't do anything. You are somewhere here and you can help them. I don't help them. I don't help people. And I don't use the word. But then genocide, if you explain to people how it is defined in the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, then some people start understanding it. But most people think that genocide is Holocaust, genocide is Rwanda, genocide is Darfur, genocide is when a very large number of people are killed physically.
Right.
And in fact, when one looks at those definitions of genocide in this Genocide Convention, there are 5 definitions and only one of them is about directly physically killing people. And 2, possibly 3 of those definitions fit exactly indigenous education, and it has nothing to do with killing people physically.
Did you help write those definitions?
I was a little bit too young to do it. The Genocide Convention is from 1948.
Oh, 48.
So,
yeah.
And it was discussed several years before it was finalized. So I was 8 years old when it was accepted by the United Nations. And the lawyer who started, who was the most important person in order to get that Genocide Convention written and accepted, a Jewish lawyer called Lemkin. He wanted to have also a prohibition of the use of a language in daily intercourse or in schools as part of the definition. And it was still in the final draft of the Genocide Convention when it went to the General Assembly of the United Nations. But 16 states voted against having that in it. But it is even linguistic and cultural genocide are indirectly in the definitions, in 2 of them, because one of the definitions of genocide is causing serious physical or mental harm to members of a group. And since physical harm is already in the killing of people, they wouldn't have needed to have that. And the mental harm part of that has to do with identity, language, culture, and so on. And I'll come back to that. The other definition, that is a definition of genocide, is forcibly transferring children from one group to another group. And assimilationist education obviously does exactly that. So after 12 years in an American school with no mother tongue. Kids don't speak that language anymore. They have been transferred to the English language and to the American culture forcibly. And forcible here means they have not had any alternative in the education system. Of course, at home, yes, but in the education system, meaning in the structure where they are forced to be, there is no alternative at all. And when one looks at those studies which follow children and see how many do not know their parents' language, their grandparents' language anymore. I mean, in the United States, it's the majority after school. But if one thinks then of this other one, mental harm, causing serious mental harm. And if we look at the statistics which are comparing majority population with the indigenous peoples in that country, in terms of things like how many are pushed out of school, how many finish which grades in school, what kind of results do they have, how many are unemployed, how much incest in the family, how many youth suicides. All these indigenous peoples who have been schooled, and immigrant children also to a large extent, to a higher and higher extent now, are incredibly much overrepresented in all of this. And also alcoholism and violence in the family and so on. And all these are long-term consequences of having forced the children to be educated through the medium of a foreign language, having their own language being forbidden in schools, as is often the case, having their culture looked down upon and called barbaric and primitive, and so on. All this causes serious mental harm, meaning it is genocide. And then if we take this back to Amartya Sen, the economics Nobel laureate, and his concept of the capabilities that children should be able to develop in school. If they are being caused serious mental harm by the school system, then obviously they are not able to develop their capabilities to the highest possible extent. And if we just take the tiny little things like hunger in the world, where it is completely unnecessary because we have enough food in the world so that nobody would need to go hungry, and so on. If we then look at the brain damage that it causes, and where after a few years it is irreversible, we are causing serious physical harm, which is then causing serious mental harm to most people in Africa and in Asia who get this brain underdevelopment or brain damage because they don't get enough food, and they don't get enough food partly, of course, if we think of the main causal factor, which is the elites in the world, but partly also because of what the elites have done to their parents and their parents, where they have not been able to fight poverty and develop their capabilities. Then this all knits together like in these Oki socks, where I now have 24 centimeters, and I think that his feet next winter are going to be 27. I measured them in July, so then I have to do this thing. So I'll have to take this to Finland when you and I go to Helsinki next week and measure, and then finish it in Helsinki. But
so we'll take the socks with us. And we're knitting this together. So I'm gonna release you here shortly. I just want to ask, what would be your definition of a perfect day?
Perfect day
for you. What is a perfect day for you?
When I remember in the morning to use the first 5 minutes thinking of all the absolutely wonderful things that I have, the privileged situation that I am in, and to see how the things that are not perfect are partially very, very small, and partially they are there to teach me something. When I have time to do my physical exercises properly, then I get a really wonderful warm hug from my husband, which obviously is most mornings. When there's something positive that is happening, both in my closest environment and in the world, something that says, that gives a little bit of hope and optimism about these small, small changes. And if they are a little bit bigger someday than the bad news, like Gaza and you know, and if I can feel that I have done just a tiny bit of something good that day, and if I can get to bed early enough.
What about some flowers?
Yes, of course. But it depends on where I am.
Yes.
If I am at a conference, yes, there may be beautiful flowers at the podium.
Yes.
If I see people smile unexpectedly, nice children's voices, happy children's voices. Of course, if I am somewhere like here, and you'll take a few pictures from here, if my agapanthus has opened, if a grandchild is here and I find a couple of strawberries, so-called wild strawberries, which are really wild here, for a grandchild, and so on. I mean, there are so many things that can make the day perfect. Good friends.
I think that's the way to leave it perfectly. Perfectly.
Thank you.
Very good. Very good.